Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September the 23rd, 2021. So they're blowing leaves outside my office. So if you hear a loud noise, that's what it is. And there's a running joke that goes on with our staff members that leaf blowers and other loud noises, such as vacuum cleaners, seem to follow me around whenever I try to have a meeting or a recording or something like that. So anyway, if it happens, that's what it is. I hope you're doing well today on this day, September 23rd. So our text for today, we've got Psalm 74. Getting my tongue tied here. Ezekiel 26, 2 Corinthians 12, and then finally 2 Samuel 19. So let's jump in, and I've got my Bible open to Psalm 74. So let's start with Psalm 74. So Psalm 74 is once again a psalm of Asaph. Second psalm in the book 3 of the Psalter. It's called a maskil of Asaph. This is scholars debate on what this actually entails. It's perhaps reflecting on its purpose, whether it's contemplative or didactic. Really, it has more to do, I would say, with it being didactic. Didactic meaning that it's meaning to teach us something. Sometimes it's related to, it's called a skillful psalm or something like that. But really, I think it kind of refers to what the totality of the Psalter is doing. Is it's teaching us something. These psalms are instructing us in things. In this case, this is a corporate lament, and it's specifically focused on a lament over the destruction of the temple. And so most scholars believe that this was actually written during the time of the exile. That's possible, although it is titled a Psalm of Asaph. But of course, remember that these titles, this is something that I haven't talked a whole lot about. These titles are not original to the Hebrew text. These were added later on. And a lot of times what they are reflective of is tradition, but it's not necessarily part of the text. So it's not necessarily part of the inspired text of the Bible. The other thing that we can say about those headings is that they do, I think, do reflect some longstanding tradition. So I think that you've heard me refer to them in the sermons before that I've been preaching this summer as being things that I think that give some insight, at least into the traditions behind these psalms. The last thing I would say is that when it talks about a psalm of David or psalm of Asaph, that phrase of David can be translated in a number of different ways in the Hebrew. It could be in honor of David, in the tradition of David, for David even. So in this case, it could be written for Asaph, in the tradition of Asaph. So it's not a huge deal in reading through these psalms. And again, I like to see them as being reflective of the traditions, the longstanding traditions behind the use of these psalms. And in this case, this was a longstanding tradition, I think, of teaching us something. Well, how does the psalmist respond to this great tragedy in his life? Well, he responds by offering up this lament that would have been participated in by all the community. It's a community lament. And so he says, "Oh God, why have you rejected us forever?" See the community aspect of it. Why does your anger smoke against your sheep of your pasture? I love how in verses 1 and 2, he identifies God's people, the sheep of your pasture, your congregation, referring to how they would gather before God to worship him. The ones that you have purchased of old, this is referring to that idea, biblical concept of redemption, purchasing from slavery, from bondage, in this case referring, I think, to the Exodus itself. So they are your congregation, your sheep. That's a kingly image, by the way, referring to God as the king, the shepherd, and his people as his sheep, and which you have redeemed to be your tribe, of your inheritance. And this Mount Zion where you have dwelt. Now he brings in Mount Zion here because of course that's where the destruction happened. the destruction of the temple on Mount Zion, where God had placed his name and dwelt among his people. Now he has, is past tense. He is not there anymore. He's not dwelling there anymore because it has been destroyed. And perhaps the people are even in exile at this very moment. But by the end, once again, as with these laments, it ends with a confession of confidence that God would remember them. Verse 18. And remember what remembering is calling to mind in order to act on them. So he's going to call these promises to mind in order to act on them and deliver them. And his confidence is based on ultimately God's person and what he's done in the past. So verses 12 through 17 really focus on the power of God and what he has done in the past to demonstrate that power in creation itself. So the psalmist is a psalmist who is confident in God, even in the midst of despair and destruction that is all around him. And so it's a neat psalm to read and to meditate on when perhaps we are going through similar situations where we are facing disarray and even destruction around us, where we can have confidence in God. So that's Psalm 74. Let's move on over to 2 Samuel 19. So remember that Absalom had just died, and David had cried out, "Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." He has this lament over his son. Understandable, obviously. We are all attached to our kids, and so we understand where David is coming from, even though Absalom was rebelling against him. And Joab comes and sees David weeping and mourning and lamenting his son, and he reproves him. That's a quite a cheeky move on Joab's part, that he would do such a thing, to confront the king and call him out for this. But he is, of course, concerned about the army being who has fought bravely against the forces of Absalom, feeling a little bit tossed aside by David in this act. And so David stops his lament, and ultimately in this chapter he's restored as king. Those who were against him in these last few chapters, those who haven't been killed yet, come and can come and try to find restoration with David. David extends clemency to most of them, although we'll read later on in chapter 2 of the book of 1 Kings that he doesn't clear all of them. In fact, as Solomon takes over as king, David, before he dies, encourages Solomon to deal with them according to his wisdom. We know what that would mean for those folks. We also see the conclusion of the issue with Mephibosheth. Remember that Mephibosheth was falsely accused a few chapters ago of rebelling against David and trying to reestablish the house of Saul. And here he comes and says, "No, I was actually tricked, or not tricked, but this one had slandered me, that had come to David." And so Mephibosheth is therefore extended some clemency by David as well. There goes the leaf blowers outside. So once again, we see David's house, though, being restored, God's commitment to his house. There's still question marks all over his house, I guess you could say, as we proceed further into this book of 2 Samuel. And we're almost to the end of David's life here. Love those leaf blowers. Ezekiel 26. So we're engaging in a section of Ezekiel where we see some prophecies regarding foreign powers, foreign nations, but here specifically regarding the nation of Tyre, in the area of Phoenicia. A little bit was the city of Tyre and the nation of Phoenicia, I guess you could say, the Phoenician people, who were once again against the Jewish people, and specifically during the exile. And so this is why God is calling them out, why they're being judged. Now, this is an interesting city. I love the ancient city of Tyre. Obviously, there's a long history between the Jews and the people of Tyre. For instance, cedars from Lebanon came down from the king of Tyre to help build the temple. You had, of course, Ahab marrying Jezebel, who's from Phoenicia. So there's a lot of history here. They had, though, just like Ammon, just like Edom, had gloated over Jerusalem's destruction, and now they're being held to account. Now, I want to show you a picture of Tyre. Tyre, of course, was an ancient, as were the Phoenicians. They were a seafaring people. Let's see if I can show this if I share my screen here. Yeah, and the city of Tyre was actually on an island. And if you see here, you've got the island off the about 700-800 meters off the coast of what would be modern day Lebanon, in the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a very much an impenetrable fortress, large walls around the island itself. And of course they were one of the most powerful navies back then as a seafaring people. So fast forward in history to July of 332 BC, Alexander the Great, so this is a couple of hundred years after the end of the Old Testament. Alexander the Great, maybe about 100 years after the end of the Old Testament, Alexander the Great comes down and desires the people of Tyre to actually surrender. Well, they refuse. And so what ends up happening is, and you can see why they might refuse. They're a protected city. Who's going to defeat them? They have this great pride, and we will see this pride, by the way, in chapters 27 and 28, which also reflect on judgment on the king of Tyre and on the people of Tyre. So what does Alexander the Great do? Well, he builds this for lack of a better term, this boardwalk, this causeway. He fills it in, fills in the land between the mainland and the island, and lays siege to Tyre and then destroys it. So don't mess with Alexander the Great is the moral of it, I guess. Let's see if I can show you. So this is an ancient map. Let me show you a modern map of Tyre. And you'll see, let's see if I can find it here. Tyre map. Satellite image. Yeah, here we go. Here's a good one. Here's a satellite image. So you see how it's now all filled in, the original island here, and then the causeway that was built here. So yeah, interesting stuff. Now, what's interesting that you'll find in these next few chapters is that the images of seafaring and oceans and waters being used as a form of judgment against Tyre itself. So that which they prided themselves in will actually become instruments of warfare that God will use against them. So that which you place your trust in, other than God, is going to come back to be used against you, I guess you could say, in this case. That's Ezekiel 26. And that finally brings us to 2 Corinthians 12. So here Paul, once again, defending his apostleship. And he has his famous, here describes his famous vision. So he's boasting. He said, if you really want me to boast, let me tell you about this guy. And he starts speaking in the third person here. I know a man in Christ 14 years ago, whether in body I do not know or out of the body I do not know, God knows. And he says, such a man was caught up into the third heaven. So he has this heavenly vision, and speaking in third person for rhetorical effect here, I think. And he's given this inexpressible sight of paradise. And he says, we could boast. I could boast about that. But instead, what I'm going to boast about, this is kind of continuing the argument of the previous chapter, is the things that the world would consider to be foolish, the suffering that I've received, and the privilege I have of serving the Lord. That's what and boasting in the Lord Himself. That's what's truly worthy of boasting. Then he says, has this famous thorn in the flesh passage, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation. For this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Twice he says that. So it's to keep him humble, in other words. And he implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave him, probably not referring to just 3 specific times, but he's probably referring to the fact that over and over again he was imploring of the Lord. And yet God allowed him to continue to suffer, so that Christ's grace might be shown to be perfected in weakness, his power perfected in weakness. And therefore, he is content with weaknesses. Reminds me of Philippians 4:11, where Paul talks about being content, and that contentment, and even as he is experiencing imprisonment in that case in Philippians, is not based on his circumstances. It was based on his relationship with Christ, and he's content with these because it's for Christ's sake. Verse 10. So what was this thorn, by the way? We're not really sure. Scholars debate this back and forth. Some say it was a physical malady of some sort, such as poor eyesight. Some say it was some other physical malady. Some say it was an emotional struggle that he was going through. Some say it was just the stresses of dealing with difficult churches like the church at Corinth. Some say it was some kind of spiritual warfare that was going on. There's a lot of different theories. But I like the fact that Paul keeps it generic, because ultimately that allows the reader to identify with that thorn. So here's something that Paul had prayed over and over again for God to remove, and yet God chooses not to, for his purposes, for, as he says, for Christ's sake. So just because we pray like Paul over and over, and God doesn't do what we want him to do, doesn't mean that we're not in right standing with God. Here, Paul, the greatest missionary the church has seen, prays over and over again, and his prayer is answered, but perhaps not in the way that Paul would have wanted, but it was the way that would glorify God the most. So, 2 Corinthians 11. Hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, September 23rd, 2021.